A customer at my cafe screamed, "Your baby is being born across the street right now, and this is what you're doing?" I was making a vanilla latte when this woman started screaming at me from the other side of the counter. Her face was bright red like she'd been running. "Your baby is being born across the street right now, and this is what you're doing?" I finished pouring the milk and looked up at her confused. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job." That's when things got crazy. She actually came around the counter, which customers are not allowed to do, and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. Her nails dug into my skin through my work shirt. "Let's go," she said, pulling me toward the door. "You were absent during this whole pregnancy, but you're not going to miss the birth of your daughter." I tried to pull away, but she had this death grip on me. My manager, Eddie, just stood there with his mouth open, not helping at all. "Lady, I don't have a wife, and certainly not a pregnant one," I said, trying to make sense of what was happening. She snorted and dragged me harder. "Yeah, 'cause you never cared to meet Lana or the rest of her friends and family," she spat back at me. My brain was spinning, trying to think of any Lana I knew. I went through every girl I'd talked to in the past year. Nothing. No Lanas at work, or gym, or anywhere. I've never met a Lana before. She stopped at the cafe door and turned to glare at me. "You better not say that in the delivery room." Before I could argue more, she yanked me across the street to the hospital. The emergency room was packed, but she marched right past everyone to the maternity ward, like she owned the place. At the sign-in desk, there was a young nurse with a butterfly tattoo on her wrist, who looked up and immediately frowned at me. "So this is the guy?" the nurse asked the crazy woman. "Yep, this is him," the woman said. "Can you believe how irresponsible and toxic he is? He doesn't even remember her name." The nurse shook her head at me like I was the worst person alive. "Room 367. They're all waiting for you." I wanted to run, but the woman still had my arm in her iron grip. She pushed me into the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. When the doors opened, there was an older couple standing in the hallway. The man was tall and bald with arms like tree trunks. The woman was shorter with the same nose as the crazy lady who'd kidnapped me. "You must be Lana's parents," I said, hoping they'd be reasonable. The dad's face turned purple. "Disgraceful," he growled, and then actually spit on my shoes. The mom just stared at me with pure hatred. "How dare you show up now after everything you put our daughter through?" I was about to explain that I had no idea what was happening when a younger guy came out of a room down the hall. He was built like a football player with blonde hair and a jaw that looked like it could cut glass. He walked straight up to me and without warning punched me square in the face. Pain exploded through my jaw and I tasted blood. I stumbled back into the wall holding my face. "Sorry," he said, cracking his knuckles. "I needed to get that out." "Who are you?" I mumbled through the pain. "Paul, Lana's boyfriend," he said. "The one who's been there for her while you pretended she didn't exist." Every single person I met kept giving me these death stares. A doctor walked by and shook his head at me. A pregnant woman in a wheelchair actually hissed. No one believed me when I said I didn't know who Lana was. Finally, Paul pushed me toward room 367. "Get in there. She's about to deliver." The delivery room was chaos. Nurses were rushing around with equipment and machines were beeping everywhere. There was a woman on the bed screaming, but I couldn't see her face because of all the medical staff around her. A doctor in blue scrubs pointed to a chair in the corner. "Father stays there until we're ready," he said. I sat down, still holding my aching jaw. The screaming got louder, and then suddenly stopped. A baby's cry filled the room. The nurses were cleaning something off and wrapping it in a pink blanket. "You can come see your daughter now," one of them said to me. My legs felt like jello as I walked toward the bed. As I got closer, the medical staff moved aside, and I finally saw the woman's face. Everything clicked at once. The room started spinning. Lana, I did know her. That house party 6 months ago when I was completely wasted. We'd made out by the pool and then nothing. I'd blacked out and woke up at home. Never saw her again or even remembered her name until right now. "You're insane," I said, staring at her exhausted face. "I want a paternity test done right now." She laughed weakly. "There's no need. Paul's infertile. I went to that party specifically looking for a father." I froze. "What?" "I only told you now because I'm going to need child support," she said, holding the crying baby. "Congratulations, Daddy." I looked around. "Not happening," and started walking out. Her dad blocked me. His chest was inches from mine, and I could smell coffee on his breath mixed with hospital antiseptic. Lana's mom tightened her grip on my other arm, her fingers digging into the bruises she'd already made dragging me here. I looked between them, trying to figure out if I could shove past without getting hurt worse than I already was. The dad was bigger than me by at least 50 pounds, and he had that look people get right before they hit someone. My brain was doing math on how much trouble I'd be in if I fought my way out versus how much danger I was in if I stayed. Behind them, Lana was saying something to the nurses, but I couldn't hear over the blood rushing in my ears. The baby was still crying that newborn cry that sounds like a car alarm. I tried to step sideways toward the window, but the mom moved with me, blocking that path too. They had me cornered, and they knew it. Paul moved between me and the doorway, and his face changed from that angry look to something else I couldn't read. He put his hand on Lana's dad's shoulder and pushed him back a step. "Let him go," Paul said, and everyone in the room went quiet, except the baby. Lana's dad turned to look at him like he'd grown a second head. "This needs to be handled through lawyers. Not like this," Paul continued, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking. "You can't keep him here against his will. That's kidnapping or something." Lana's mom let go of my arm, looking confused. "But he needs to take responsibility," she said, and her voice cracked. Paul shook his head. "He will or he won't, but you can't force him. Not like this." I didn't wait to hear more. The second her fingers left my arm, I bolted for the door. I ran past Paul and the dad, who tried to grab me but missed, out into the hallway where other hospital rooms had their doors open and people stared as I sprinted past. The elevator was too slow, so I hit the stairs, taking them two at a time and nearly falling twice. My work shoes weren't made for running, and they slapped loud against the concrete steps. I burst through the ground floor exit door and kept running across the parking lot. Cars honked as I ran between them, not looking. My jaw was throbbing where Paul had punched me, and every breath hurt in my chest. I didn't look back to see if anyone was following. I just ran, past the hospital, past the cafe where I'd been working an hour ago when my life was normal, past 3 blocks of shops and restaurants, past people on sidewalks who turned to stare at the crazy guy running like someone was chasing him. I finally stopped in a convenience store parking lot 6 blocks away and bent over trying to breathe. My whole body was shaking, so hard I thought I might throw up. My arm ached where Lana's mom had grabbed me, and I could see red marks forming that would definitely bruise. I pulled out my phone and my hands were shaking, so bad it took 3 tries to unlock it. I scrolled to Mom in my contacts and pressed call. It rang twice before she answered. "Hey, sweetie, what's up?" Her normal voice made something break inside me, and I started crying right there in the parking lot. "Mom, something really bad just happened," I said, and the words came out all shaky and wrong. I tried to explain about the woman dragging me from work, and the hospital, and Lana, and the baby, and Paul punching me, but it all came out jumbled. She kept saying, "Slow down, breathe," but I couldn't slow down. "She said she got pregnant on purpose," I finally managed to say. "She said she went to that party looking for someone to be the father because her boyfriend can't have kids." "Mom, I don't even remember her. I was so drunk that night I blacked out." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. "Where are you right now?" she asked, and her voice had changed to that mom voice she uses when things are serious. I looked around. Some parking lot. I don't know. A convenience store on 4th Street, I think. "Stay exactly where you are," she said. "I'm getting in my car right now. We're going to fix this together because what she did isn't okay. Do you hear me? This isn't your fault." I sat down on the curb, still holding my phone after we hung up. My mom lives 2 hours away, so I had time to kill. I opened the browser on my phone and typed, "Got someone pregnant while blackout drunk," into the search bar. The results that came up made my stomach hurt. Article after article about consent and whether drunk people can consent to sex. I clicked on one from a legal website. Then I searched reproductive coercion because I'd seen that phrase in one of the articles. A whole page of results came up. Apparently there's actual legal words for what happened to me. The articles talked about consent and bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. One article said that intentionally getting pregnant without the other person's knowledge or agreement is a form of assault in some places. Another one talked about how men can be victims too, even though people don't usually think about it that way. I sat there reading on my phone while people went in and out of the convenience store giving me weird looks. This wasn't just some crazy situation. This was potentially a crime against me. My mom's car pulled into the parking lot an hour and 45 minutes later. She must have been speeding the whole way. She got out and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and I started crying again. "Let me see your face," she said, pulling back to look at my jaw where Paul had hit me. It was already swelling up and probably turning purple. She looked at my arm next where the finger marks were dark red against my skin. "We're going to the emergency room right now," she said. "We need to document this." I started to argue that I was fine, but she gave me that look that means don't even try. We got in her car and drove back to the hospital I'd just run away from. Different entrance this time, the actual ER. We checked in at the desk, and I had to explain to the nurse what happened. She took pictures of my jaw and my arm with a camera. Then a doctor came in to examine me. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and glasses. He asked me careful questions about what happened, who hit me, who grabbed me, whether I'd agreed to go to the hospital. "So you were physically forced against your will?" he asked, writing notes. I nodded. "You should file a police report," he said, looking up from his clipboard. "What happened to you isn't legal. The assault, the false imprisonment, none of it." We left the ER with paperwork documenting my injuries and drove straight to the police station. It was almost 8 at night by then, and I was exhausted, but my mom insisted we do it right away. The officer at the desk looked bored until I started explaining what happened. Then he looked skeptical. He kept interrupting to ask questions. "Why didn't you just leave the hospital?" he asked for the third time. I tried to explain how trapped I felt with Lana's whole family surrounding me in an unfamiliar building, how her dad was blocking the door and her mom had my arm, how Paul had punched me, and I was scared of getting hit again. The officer wrote it all down, but I could tell he didn't really get it. He probably thought I should have just pushed past them or called security or something. He took my statement and the ER paperwork and said someone would follow up. I didn't believe him, but at least it was on record now. My mom wouldn't let me go back to my apartment. "What if they show up there?" she said, and I realized she was right. Lana's family knew where I worked, so they probably knew where I lived too. We drove to her place and she set me up on the couch with blankets and pillows. I lay there in the dark after she went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. My brain kept trying to remember that party 6 months ago. I remembered going with some guys from the gym. I remembered the house was big with a pool in the back. I remembered doing shots in the kitchen. Then nothing. Just blank, empty space where memories should be. I tried so hard to picture Lana's face before today. Tried to remember talking to her or dancing or anything. But there was nothing there. Just black. I must have passed out or blacked out and someone got me home somehow. I never knew anything happened with anyone. Never knew there was a Lana. And now there was a baby. My brain couldn't make it make sense. I called work the next morning before my shift was supposed to start. Eddie answered on the second ring. "Hey man, are you okay?" he asked before I could say anything. "I saw that woman drag you out yesterday. What the hell was that about?" I explained the whole thing. The hospital, the baby, Lana admitting she did it on purpose, Paul punching me, running away. Eddie was quiet for a minute after I finished. "That's insane," he finally said. "Like actually insane. You were literally kidnapped from work." "I know," I said. "I filed a police report and everything." "Good," Eddie said. "I'll back you up. I saw the whole thing. She came around the counter and grabbed you and you were trying to get away. I'll give a witness statement if you need one. And don't worry about work. Take whatever time you need." I thanked him and hung up, feeling slightly less alone. I spent the rest of the morning on my mom's couch with my laptop researching family law attorneys in the area. Every website I clicked on made me feel more hopeless. Consultation fees were $200, $300. Some didn't even list prices, which meant they were definitely too expensive. The retainer fees were even worse. $3,000, $5,000. One place wanted $10,000 up front. I made barely above minimum wage as a barista. I had maybe $800 in my savings account. Most of these lawyers cost more for one meeting than I made in a week. I kept searching anyway, writing down names and numbers, trying to find someone I could maybe afford. My mom came in and sat next to me. "How bad is it?" she asked, looking at the screen. I showed her the numbers. She was quiet for a minute. "I have some money saved up," she said, "for a new car, but this is more important." I didn't want to take her money, but I also knew I couldn't fight this alone. I nodded, and she picked up her phone right there, pulling up a list of family law attorneys she'd already researched. She started calling them one by one, asking about consultations and availability. The first two couldn't see me for over a week, but the third had an opening tomorrow morning. She booked it, and then called 2 more places, setting up meetings for the day after. I sat there watching her take charge of this mess, feeling like a kid again instead of a grown man with a job and his own apartment. That night I barely slept, running through what I'd say to these lawyers over and over in my head. The next morning, my mom drove me to the first consultation in a glass office building downtown. The waiting room had leather chairs and a water feature that made annoying, trickling sounds. A secretary led us back to meet the attorney, an older guy in an expensive suit who looked bored before I even started talking. I explained everything from the beginning while he checked his phone twice. When I got to the part about being blackout drunk and not remembering anything, he held up his hand. He told me I should just work out a payment plan with Lana because fighting this would cost more than child support. I mentioned that she admitted to doing this on purpose and he shrugged, saying that didn't matter once a baby existed. My mom asked about reproductive coercion and he actually laughed, saying that wasn't a real legal concept for men. We left after 15 minutes and I felt sick, like maybe everyone would see it that way. The second consultation the next day was in a smaller office across town. This attorney was a woman around 40 who at least listened to the whole story without interrupting. She took notes and asked good questions about the timeline and what Lana had said at the hospital. When I finished, she leaned back and admitted she didn't have much experience with cases like mine. She'd mostly handled divorces and custody disputes between married couples. She said I needed someone who specialized in reproductive rights and men's issues, then wrote down a name on her business card. Quentin Fowler, 2 towns over. She said he'd argued cases about reproductive fraud before and would understand what I was dealing with. My mom called his office from the parking lot and got an appointment for that afternoon. We drove 40 minutes to a residential area where his office turned out to be a converted house with a small sign out front. Inside looked nothing like the fancy places we'd been. Mismatched furniture filled the waiting room and stacks of legal books covered every surface. A young guy at the front desk told us to go straight back. Quentin's office was just as messy, with files piled on chairs and sticky notes covering his computer monitor. He looked younger than I expected, maybe 35, with glasses and a wrinkled shirt. But when I started explaining what happened, he didn't check his phone or look bored. He just listened, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. I told him about the party, the blackout, waking up at home with no memory. I told him about being dragged to the hospital and Lana's admission that she'd done this on purpose. I told him about Paul punching me and her family spitting on my shoes. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and said this was exactly the kind of case he took. He explained that, yeah, I was probably the biological father based on what I'd described, but he said the circumstances of conception mattered legally and ethically. He talked about demanding a paternity test through proper channels, documenting the lack of consent, building a case that child support should be reduced or structured differently because of the reproductive coercion. He used that exact phrase and it made me feel less crazy. He said we'd argue that what Lana did violated my reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. The retainer fee was $3,000, which made my stomach drop. But Quentin said he'd do a payment plan because he believed in this case and wanted to establish legal precedent around consent in conception. My mom pulled out her checkbook and wrote a check for $1,000 as the first payment. I signed paperwork that made everything feel terrifyingly real. Quentin said he'd send a formal letter to Lana through the hospital address, demanding a court-ordered paternity test and putting her on notice that we were challenging any support claims. He'd document everything, including her admission about intentionally seeking me out as a sperm donor. We left his office, and I felt like maybe someone finally understood that this wasn't just about avoiding responsibility. 2 days later, I was working the morning shift at the cafe when Lana's mother burst through the door. She started screaming before she even reached the counter, waving a piece of paper in the air. She called me every name she could think of, saying I was trying to abandon my daughter with legal tricks. Other customers stopped what they were doing and stared. Lana's father came in behind her, his face red and his fists clenched. Eddie came out from the back and positioned himself between them and me. He told them they needed to leave, or he'd call the police. Lana's mother kept screaming about the lawyer letter, and how dare I question paternity when everyone knew the baby was mine. 3 regular customers who'd been sitting by the window got up and stood near Eddie, not saying anything but making it clear they had my back. Eddie pulled out his phone and started dialing. That finally made them leave, but not before Lana's father knocked over a display of coffee mugs near the door. After they left, I was shaking, so hard I had to sit down in the back room. Eddie came back and told me not to worry, that everyone saw them harassing me. He said 3 customers had already given him their contact information in case I needed witnesses. One of them was a regular named Beth, who came in every morning for a cappuccino. She'd seen the whole thing and told Eddie she'd be happy to write a statement about the harassment. I called Quentin from the back room and told him what happened. He said to write down everything I remembered while it was fresh, including the names of witnesses. That afternoon, he filed a petition with family court requesting the paternity test and a temporary restraining order against Lana's family because of the harassment and assault at the hospital. He said the court date was set for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks felt like forever when my life was falling apart around me. The next day at work, I was pouring a cappuccino when a customer raised his voice about wanting extra foam. My hands started shaking so bad I nearly dropped the pitcher. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe right. The guy kept talking, but all I could hear was that woman's voice screaming at me. I set down the pitcher and walked to the back room. Eddie found me sitting on a milk crate trying to get air into my lungs. He didn't ask questions, just told me to take 10 minutes. After that, he started scheduling me for more inventory and prep work in the back. I spent my shifts counting coffee beans and organizing supplies instead of dealing with customers. It helped, but I felt broken, like I couldn't even do my basic job anymore without falling apart. My mom called every day to check on me, and one morning she said she found someone who could help. The therapist's office was in a house that had been converted into medical suites. I sat in the waiting room feeling stupid for needing therapy over something people kept telling me I should just accept. The therapist was older with gray hair and glasses. She had me explain everything that happened. When I got to the part about being dragged from work, she stopped me and said what I experienced was a violation of my bodily autonomy. She used those exact words. She said men can be victims of reproductive coercion, and what I was feeling was a normal trauma response. I wanted to cry from relief, that someone finally understood this wasn't just me being difficult. My mom was paying for the sessions from money she'd saved for a new car. I felt guilty about that on top of everything else. Then Lana posted on social media. Someone sent me a screenshot because I'd already blocked her. The photo showed her holding the baby with a long caption about how I abandoned them. She wrote that I refused to even meet my daughter or help with any expenses. She tagged the cafe's business page and 3 local community groups. My phone started blowing up within an hour. Messages from people I'd never met calling me worthless and selfish. Comments saying I should be forced to pay or thrown in jail. Someone found my personal account and posted my photo in the comments saying this was what a deadbeat looked like. I screenshotted everything with shaking hands. Quentin told me not to respond publicly, no matter how much I wanted to defend myself. He said engaging would only make it worse, and we needed to document the harassment for court. It was torture watching strangers tear me apart online, while I couldn't say anything back. The cafe's social media filled up with comments about me. People saying they'd never come back if the business employed someone like me. Others demanding Eddie fire me. Eddie had to turn off comments completely and remove the review section. He called me into his office, and I thought for sure I was getting fired. Instead, he told me my job was safe, and he believed me. But I could see the stress on his face. The cafe's reputation was taking hits because of me. I offered to quit, but he refused. That just made me feel worse, knowing I was hurting someone who'd been good to me. 3 weeks after Quentin filed the petition, we had our first court date. I put on the only dress shirt I owned and met Quentin outside the courthouse. My stomach was doing flips. We walked into the courtroom, and there was Lana sitting at the other table with her lawyer. This was the first time I'd seen her since the hospital. She looked tired, but she glared at me like I was the villain in this story. Her lawyer argued that a paternity test wasn't needed because Paul was infertile, so obviously I was the father. Quentin stood up and said establishing paternity through proper legal channels was my right, regardless of anyone's fertility status. The judge was an older man who looked bored with the whole thing. He ordered the paternity test and granted a temporary restraining order against Lana's family. Lana's lawyer objected, but the judge cut her off, saying the assault and harassment were documented. I felt a tiny bit of relief walking out of there. The paternity test appointment was at a lab in a strip mall. I sat in the waiting room trying not to look at Lana, who was across from me with the baby. The baby made little sounds, and I forced myself not to look over. A technician called us back to a room with medical posters on the walls. She handed me a long swab and told me to rub it inside my cheek for 30 seconds. Lana sat in a chair by the wall holding the baby the whole time. The technician took the swab from me and then swabbed the baby's cheek while it squirmed. The whole thing took maybe 5 minutes. The technician said results would be ready in 2 weeks and we could leave. Walking out to my car, I felt sick. That baby might be genetically connected to me, and I felt absolutely nothing looking at it. The 2 weeks waiting for results were awful. Every morning I woke up and checked my phone hoping for an email from Quentin. Every day there was nothing. My mom had me come over to help her repaint her kitchen, but I kept messing up because I couldn't focus. She'd ask me to hand her the roller and I'd just stand there staring at nothing. My brain was stuck playing out every possible outcome. What if the test came back positive? What if I really was the father? What if I had to pay support for 18 years? What if people kept harassing me forever? I couldn't shut my thoughts off. One night I couldn't sleep, so I started Googling Lana's name. I found her Facebook and Instagram, but they were private. Then I tried adding fertility forum names to the search. That's when I found her posts on a trying to conceive message board. She'd been active for over a year. Posts about Paul's infertility. Posts about wanting a baby desperately. Posts asking others how they'd dealt with similar situations. I called Quentin the next morning and he helped me archive everything. We found posts from 8 months ago where she talked about Paul's test results confirming he couldn't have kids. Posts from 7 months ago discussing options. One post from 7 months ago made my stomach turn. She wrote that her boyfriend couldn't give her a baby and asked if anyone had considered alternative options. Another user responded suggesting she could find a one-night stand at a party and her boyfriend would never have to know. Lana's response was just a thinking emoji. The timeline matched exactly. 7 months ago, right before that party where I blacked out. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. This wasn't an accident. She'd planned this. She'd gone to that party specifically looking for someone to use. I was just some random guy she'd picked because I was drunk enough not to remember. Quentin said this evidence was huge for our case. It proved intent and premeditation. It showed this was reproductive fraud, not just an unexpected pregnancy, but knowing the truth just made everything feel more violating. I hadn't just been used. I'd been hunted. Quentin spent the next 2 days building our case around those forum posts. He printed everything and organized it into a timeline showing Lana's planning. She'd posted about Paul's test results in March. She'd asked about alternative options in April. The party where I blacked out happened in May. Quentin explained this proved intent to deceive. He said judges consider circumstances of conception when setting support amounts. If we could show I was deliberately targeted without my knowledge or agreement, then my financial responsibility might be reduced. The evidence made me feel slightly less crazy, but also more violated knowing she'd actually planned it. My first therapy session happened 3 days after finding the posts. The therapist was older with gray hair and asked me to explain what brought me in. I told her about the party, the blackout, Lana's admission at the hospital. She listened without judging and then said something that stuck with me. She explained, reproductive autonomy means having control over if and when you become a parent. She said what happened to me was a violation of that autonomy regardless of my gender. Society doesn't usually recognize men as victims in pregnancy situations, but that doesn't make the trauma less real. Hearing those words from a professional made something loosen in my chest. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't being dramatic. What Lana did actually mattered. The sessions became weekly, and each one helped me process a different piece of the nightmare. 1 week about the message from Paul that appeared in my Instagram requests. His profile picture showed him on a boat holding a fishing rod. The message was short, asking if we could talk without lawyers or family around. I stared at my phone for 10 minutes trying to figure out his angle. Was this a trap? Did Lana send him to manipulate me? I screenshot the message and sent it to Quentin, who called me immediately. He said it was my choice, but advised caution. Paul might be gathering information for Lana's side, but something in the message felt genuine. I wrote back saying we could meet at the public park near the library. Paul responded within minutes, agreeing to meet the next afternoon. I got there early and sat on a bench near the playground watching kids on the swings. Paul showed up exactly on time, walking across the grass toward me. He looked different from the hospital. His face was thinner, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in weeks. He sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving space between us. The first thing he said was an apology for punching me. He rubbed his knuckles and admitted he'd been wrong. Lana had told him I'd followed her around at the party, being aggressive and pushy. She'd made it sound like I was some creep who'd taken advantage of her when she was vulnerable. Paul had believed her completely and wanted to defend her honor. Now he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. I asked him what changed his mind. Paul pulled out his phone and showed me screenshots of Lana's forum posts. He'd found them the same way I did, by searching her username across different sites. Reading her words about needing a baby and considering one-night stands had made him sick. He'd confronted her, and she'd tried to say it was all hypothetical, but the dates matched too perfectly. The timeline proved she'd gone to that party hunting for someone to use. Paul leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the playground. He started talking about their relationship and how controlling Lana had become over the past year. She'd isolated him from his friends. She'd made all their decisions about where to live and what to do. He'd thought it was just her being organized and knowing what she wanted. Now he realized she'd been manipulating him the whole time. He said he felt used too, like she'd picked him as a provider and caretaker, while going elsewhere for the genetic material she actually wanted. His voice cracked when he admitted he'd loved her and thought they'd build a family together someday through adoption or other options. Finding out she'd done this behind his back destroyed everything he'd believed about their relationship. I asked if Lana's parents knew about the forum posts or her hospital admission. Paul shook his head. They had no idea their daughter had planned any of this. Lana had told them I was her ex-boyfriend who'd gotten her pregnant and then ghosted her. They genuinely believed I'd abandoned their daughter during her pregnancy. Paul said he'd tried to tell them the truth, but they wouldn't listen. They'd invested so much in hating me that admitting Lana lied would mean facing their own actions. He looked torn, sitting there like part of him still wanted to protect Lana despite everything. I understood that feeling. Even when someone hurts you, it's hard to completely stop caring about them. We sat in silence for a minute, watching a mom push her toddler on the swing. Finally, I asked Paul what he wanted from this conversation. He turned to look at me and said honestly he didn't know. Maybe he just needed to talk to someone who understood what it felt like to be manipulated by Lana. Maybe he wanted to make sure I knew he hadn't been part of her plan. We exchanged phone numbers before he left. Paul said he'd think about whether he could provide testimony about what Lana had told him. He wasn't ready to commit, but he wasn't saying no either. The paternity results arrived 2 weeks later. Quentin called me to come to his office instead of emailing them. I knew that meant the news wasn't good. Walking into his office, I saw the envelope on his desk with the lab's logo. He handed it to me, and I opened it with shaking hands. The document had lots of technical language about genetic markers and probability percentages. The conclusion was clear, though. 99.9% certainty that I was the biological father. I sat down hard in the chair across from Quentin's desk. My ears were ringing, and the room felt too hot. There was a baby in the world who shared my DNA, a child I'd never agreed to create with a woman who'd used me without my knowledge. The reality of it hit me like a truck. Quentin gave me a minute to process before starting to talk about next steps. He said we'd pivot our legal strategy to focus on reduced support obligations and minimal custody. The circumstances of conception mattered. Courts had to consider the lack of consent and the fraud involved when determining my financial and parental responsibilities. He explained I had biological responsibility now that paternity was confirmed, but that didn't mean I owed Lana everything she'd demand. We could argue for lower payments based on the reproductive coercion. We could request supervised visitation only if I chose to have any relationship with the child. Quentin said judges had discretion in these cases, especially with our evidence. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment from Lana's lawyer. Inside was a demand letter typed on official letterwork requesting full child support payments calculated from my income. They wanted 40% of my paycheck plus half of all childcare costs and half of all medical expenses. I did the math sitting at my kitchen table. 40% would leave me barely enough to cover rent and food. I'd have to get a second job or move back in with my mom permanently. The amount felt deliberately punishing, like they were trying to destroy my life for not playing along with Lana's plan. I drove to my mom's house that night because I couldn't stand being alone with those numbers in my head. She opened the door and took one look at my face before pulling me inside. I sat on her couch and showed her the demand letter with shaking hands. She read it twice, and her face got tight and angry. I started doing the math out loud, calculating what 40% of my paycheck meant for rent and food and gas. The numbers didn't work no matter how I rearranged them. I'd have to get a second job working nights or weekends just to survive, or move back here permanently and sleep on this couch for the next 18 years. My voice cracked when I said that part, and suddenly I was crying, really crying, for the first time since this whole thing started. My mom sat next to me and didn't say anything, just let me fall apart on her shoulder. The injustice of it burned in my chest. I never agreed to any of this, never chose to create a child, never even remembered the night it happened. But somehow I was the one being punished while Lana got exactly what she wanted. I cried until my head hurt and my throat was raw. My mom made tea, and we sat there until almost midnight talking about options. She offered to let me move back in, but I could see the worry in her eyes about money. She was barely making it herself on her salary. I couldn't become another burden for her to carry. The next morning, I met with Quentin at his office to discuss our response. He'd already started drafting paperwork arguing for reduced support based on reproductive fraud. The document was thick, full of legal language about consent and bodily autonomy. He showed me sections citing the forum posts where Lana discussed seeking alternative options for having a baby. Other parts referenced her admission in the hospital about going to that party specifically to find a father. Quentin explained we were requesting support be calculated at a lower percentage given the circumstances. He also wanted custody arrangements to be minimal and supervised only, arguing I had no relationship with this child and the conception involved trauma. I signed the papers authorizing him to file everything with the court. He said the response would go to Lana's lawyer within 48 hours. Part of me felt guilty about fighting against supporting a baby who didn't ask to be born into this mess. But another part of me knew I couldn't let Lana destroy my life completely just because her plan worked. 3 days before our court hearing, my phone rang with a number I recognized. Paul. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice sounded different from at the hospital, quieter and less angry. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about everything, about what Lana said in that delivery room, about the forum posts I'd found, about how she'd acted during the whole pregnancy. He said he was moving out of their apartment and ending the relationship. His voice got rough when he said he finally was accepted that she'd manipulated both of us. Then he said something that made my heart race. He was willing to testify at the hearing about what Lana had told him regarding her intentions, about how she'd admitted Paul was infertile and she needed to find someone else, about conversations they'd had during the pregnancy, where she seemed more focused on getting financial support than anything else. I asked him why he was doing this, and he was quiet for a minute. Then he said, because it was the truth, and he was tired of protecting someone who'd used him as much as she'd used me. We talked for almost an hour about logistics and what Quentin would need from him. When we hung up, I immediately called Quentin to tell him about Paul's offer to testify. Quentin sounded excited, saying Paul's testimony could be huge for our case. The courthouse was cold and echoey when we arrived for the hearing. Quentin carried a briefcase full of documents while I tried to keep my hands from shaking. Lana sat on the other side of the courtroom with her lawyer, a tall woman in an expensive suit. Lana wouldn't look at me. Paul showed up 20 minutes before we started, nodding at me from across the room. The judge was an older man with gray hair who looked tired. Lana's lawyer went first, painting me as someone trying to escape responsibility. She talked about the baby's needs and my obligation as the biological father. She made it sound like I'd known about the pregnancy all along and just didn't care. My jaw clenched, listening to her twist everything. Then Quentin stood up and started presenting our evidence. He showed the forum posts where Lana discussed wanting a baby despite Paul's infertility. He read parts of her admission from the hospital where she said she went to that party specifically looking for a father. He talked about consent and reproductive coercion and bodily autonomy. The judge leaned forward, actually paying attention. Then Quentin called Paul to testify. Paul walked to the witness stand looking nervous but determined. Under oath, he confirmed that he was infertile and had been in a relationship with Lana. He described conversations where Lana talked about her options for having a baby. He testified about what she'd said in the delivery room about intentionally seeking me out. Lana's lawyer objected several times, but the judge let Paul continue. When Quentin asked about the forum posts, Paul confirmed he'd seen similar conversations between Lana and her friends about finding someone at parties. The courtroom felt different after Paul's testimony. Even Lana's lawyer looked surprised. Then it was Lana's turn to take the stand. She looked small sitting there, nothing like the confident woman from the hospital. Quentin asked her about the forum posts, and she claimed they were just hypothetical discussions between friends. She said our encounter at the party was mutually desired and meaningful. But when Quentin pressed her on details, her story started shifting. First, she said we'd talked for hours. Then she said it was more like an hour. She couldn't remember what we supposedly talked about. Quentin asked why she never tried to contact me after the party if we'd had such a meaningful connection. Lana stumbled over her answer, saying she lost my number. But then Quentin pointed out she'd never asked for my number according to her own previous statement. She said she got it from a mutual friend, but couldn't name the friend. Her lawyer objected again, but the damage was done. Lana kept contradicting herself, getting defensive and angry. She insisted everything was my fault for not remembering her. Quentin asked about her admission in the hospital, that she'd gone to the party looking for a father. Lana tried to claim she'd been confused after giving birth, that she didn't mean it that way. But her voice wavered, and even the judge looked skeptical. When she finally stepped down, she was crying, and her lawyer looked frustrated. The judge called for a recess, and everyone stood up. I thought we'd get a decision right away, but instead, the judge said he was assigning a court psychologist to evaluate all parties. Her name was Juliet McLean, and she'd provide recommendations about custody and support arrangements. The evaluation would take 4 weeks, which meant waiting even longer for answers. But Quentin seemed pleased when we left the courtroom. He said the judge ordering an evaluation meant he was taking the reproductive coercion seriously. If he'd dismissed our arguments, he would have just ruled immediately. 4 weeks felt like forever, but it also gave us more time to build our case. Paul caught up with us in the parking lot and asked how I thought it went. I told him his testimony had clearly made an impact. He looked relieved, like he'd been worried about doing the right thing. We shook hands before he left, and it felt strange having this connection with someone who'd punched me just months ago. Juliet's office was in a medical building downtown with plants in the waiting room. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with glasses and a calm way of talking. The evaluation session lasted 2 hours. She asked about my memory of the party, and I admitted I had none. She asked how I felt about having biological responsibility for a child I never agreed to create. I was honest about the trauma and confusion, about feeling violated even though society didn't recognize men as victims in reproductive situations, about my conflicted feelings toward a baby who existed because someone used my body without consent. Juliet listened carefully and took notes, but never seemed judgmental. She asked what kind of relationship I could imagine having with this child, and I said honestly, I didn't know. Maybe someday when I'd processed everything. Maybe never. I didn't feel like a father. I felt like a victim being forced into a role I never chose. She asked about the support demand, and I showed her my budget, explaining how 40% would make it impossible to survive. She asked about my job and my plans, and whether I'd ever wanted kids. I told her maybe someday with someone I chose, when I was ready, but not like this. Never like this. When the session ended, Juliet said she'd be meeting with Lana and Paul separately over the next 2 weeks. Paul texted me after his evaluation saying Juliet had asked detailed questions about Lana's behavior during the pregnancy, about statements Lana made regarding intentionally seeking a sperm donor, about the forum posts and conversations with friends. He said Juliet seemed to understand this wasn't a typical paternity case, that there were layers of manipulation and consent issues that mattered. Paul felt hopeful after his session, and that made me feel slightly better too. At least someone in an official position was taking this seriously, instead of just assuming I should accept everything. My therapist had been suggesting for weeks that I attend a support group for men dealing with reproductive coercion. I'd resisted because part of me felt embarrassed about the whole situation, but after the evaluation with Juliet, I decided to go. The group met in a church basement on Tuesday nights. There were 6 other guys there, ranging from early 20s to maybe 50. Each of them had stories about being trapped by pregnancy they didn't agree to. One guy's girlfriend had lied about birth control. Another had a one-night stand where the woman said she couldn't get pregnant. A third had been told his girlfriend had an IUD when she didn't. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone and less crazy. Society didn't talk about men as victims in reproductive situations, but it happened more than people realized. We weren't deadbeats trying to escape responsibility. We were people whose consent had been violated in ways that had permanent consequences. The group leader talked about setting boundaries and processing trauma, about the difference between biological responsibility and emotional readiness, about how we could fulfill legal obligations without pretending to have feelings we didn't have. Walking out of that church basement, I felt lighter somehow. Like maybe I wasn't broken for struggling with something everyone said I should just accept. My mom called me the next afternoon sounding confused. She said Lana's parents had tried to contact her directly. They'd called her work number somehow and asked if they could talk. My mom refused to engage without lawyers present like Quentin had instructed, but she said they seemed different from before, less hostile and more confused. They kept asking questions about what actually happened at that party, about whether I really didn't remember Lana, about the timeline of events. My mom said Lana's mother had sounded almost apologetic, though she didn't actually apologize. It seemed like Paul's testimony at the hearing had planted seeds of doubt about their daughter's version of events. They'd invested so much in believing I was the villain that questioning Lana meant questioning their own actions, the spitting and the death stares and the assault they'd enabled. My mom told them any communication needed to go through Quentin and hung up, but she said something in their voices had changed, like maybe they were starting to see cracks in Lana's story. 2 weeks later, Quentin called me to his office because Juliet's evaluation report had arrived. I sat across from his desk while he flipped through the pages, his expression getting more positive with each section he read. The report was 20 pages long with detailed notes from all the interviews and evidence review. Juliet had written that the documented reproductive fraud was a major factor that should influence support obligations. She recommended setting payments at a lower percentage that would increase slowly as my income grew over time. The report also said I should only have supervised visitation rights if I chose to pursue any relationship with the child. Juliet had included a whole section about trauma and consent violations, acknowledging that I had the right to set boundaries around a situation I never agreed to. Quentin looked up at me and said, "This was exactly what we needed." The report gave us strong backing for everything we'd been arguing in court. He made copies and started preparing for the next hearing scheduled in 3 days. I left his office feeling something I hadn't felt in months, like maybe the system was actually listening to what happened to me, instead of just assuming I should accept everything. The courthouse was packed when we arrived for the hearing. Lana sat at the other table with her lawyer, not looking at me once during the whole proceeding. The judge came in, and everyone stood up. Then he started reviewing Juliet's report out loud. He read the sections about reproductive fraud and consent violations, nodding as he went through the recommendations. Lana's lawyer tried to argue that the report was biased and didn't consider the child's needs properly. The judge cut her off and said the child's needs were important, but so was the context of how the child came to exist. He issued a temporary order right there setting support at 20% of my income instead of the 40% Lana had demanded. The order included a clause saying the amount could be changed if evidence of fraud got proven in criminal court. Then the judge granted the restraining order against Lana's family for the assault and harassment. He looked directly at Lana and told her she needed to stop all the social media posts and public harassment immediately, or she'd face contempt charges. My hands were shaking as I wrote down everything the judge said. 20% was still a lot of money, but it was manageable with my current job. I wouldn't have to move back home permanently or get a second job just to survive. Quentin squeezed my shoulder as we left the courtroom. The next step was filing a formal complaint with the district attorney about what Lana did. Quentin drove me to the DA's office downtown in a building with metal detectors and security guards everywhere. We sat in a waiting room for an hour before a prosecutor finally called us back. The prosecutor was a woman in her 50s who looked tired and overworked. Quentin explained the whole situation while she took notes, showing her copies of the forum posts and Lana's admission at the hospital. She listened carefully, but her face told me she wasn't optimistic. When Quentin finished, she put down her pen and said honestly, criminal prosecution for reproductive coercion was extremely rare. The laws weren't clear, and juries had a hard time seeing men as victims in these situations. She said she'd open a case file and document everything we brought her, but I shouldn't expect charges to actually be filed. Quentin had warned me this would probably happen, but hearing it still hurt. The prosecutor did say having an official complaint on record would help our civil case and document the harm done. She gave me a case number and told me to contact her if I remembered any other details about that night at the party. Walking out of the DA's office, I felt frustrated that the criminal system wouldn't help, but also relieved that at least someone official had written down what happened to me. 2 months after that horrible day at the hospital, I finally moved back to my own apartment. My mom helped me pack up my stuff from her place and drove me home. The apartment felt different somehow, like I was seeing it with new eyes after everything that happened. I unpacked slowly, putting things back where they belonged, and trying to reclaim my space. The reduced support payments were manageable with my barista job, though I was still working extra shifts on weekends to build up savings. Quentin had warned me that Lana might try to modify the order later if her situation changed, so I needed a cushion in case court costs came up again. I set up automatic payments so I wouldn't have to think about it every month. The money went into an account for the baby, and I tried not to picture where it actually went or what it paid for. My therapist said it was okay to fulfill my legal obligations without engaging emotionally, that I could send money without pretending to have feelings I didn't have. Being back in my own place felt like taking back control of my life piece by piece. Paul started texting me every few weeks just to check in and see how I was doing. At first, it felt weird having any contact with someone so connected to Lana, but gradually I realized we had this shared experience that nobody else really understood. We met up for coffee one afternoon, and he told me about his therapy sessions. His therapist was helping him process how Lana had manipulated both of us for her own purposes. Paul said he was starting to date again, but being very careful about trust and honesty. He'd learned that he needed someone who valued mutual respect, instead of just using him as a provider, while she did whatever she wanted. We talked about how society didn't really have language for what happened to us, how men being victims of reproductive coercion wasn't something people took seriously. Paul had joined a support group similar to mine and found it helpful to talk with other guys who'd been through similar things. By the end of coffee, I realized we'd actually become friends in this unlikely way, bonded by being manipulated by the same person. He texted me later that week about a basketball game, and we made plans to go together. 3 months after the temporary order, Lana made one final attempt to contact me directly. A long message showed up in my phone from a number I didn't recognize. She must have gotten a new phone or borrowed someone else's to get around the restraining order. The message went on for paragraphs about how she did everything for love of the baby and couldn't understand why I was being so difficult. She said the baby deserved a father who cared, and I was being selfish, putting my own feelings first. She claimed she never meant to hurt anyone and just wanted to create a family. The message made my stomach turn, because even now she couldn't acknowledge what she'd actually done. There was no apology or recognition that she'd violated my consent, just more excuses and blame shifting, making herself the victim of my supposed cruelty. I took screenshots of the entire message and forwarded it to Quentin without typing any response. He replied within an hour, saying this was perfect evidence of continued harassment despite court orders. Her complete lack of understanding about why what she did was wrong just confirmed that I'd made the right choice keeping boundaries. I blocked the number and tried to forget about it. 6 months after that horrible day in the hospital, I was in a much better place mentally and emotionally. Therapy had helped me process the trauma in ways I didn't think were possible back when everything first happened. I'd learned to set firm boundaries with people and situations, understanding that I could fulfill my legal obligations without sacrificing my own well-being. The support group continued to be helpful, giving me a place to talk about things most people didn't understand. My therapist helped me see that I didn't have to pretend to have feelings I didn't have just because society expected certain emotions from biological parents. I could acknowledge the reality of the situation while also protecting myself from further harm. Work was going well, and Eddie had mentioned possibly promoting me to shift supervisor. The regular customers who'd witnessed the harassment had become protective of me in this sweet way, always asking how I was doing. I'd started dating again cautiously, being very upfront about my situation and the importance of clear consent and communication. It felt good to be excited about my future again, instead of just surviving day to day. The judge called us back to court for a final hearing to make the temporary orders permanent. Quentin had prepared a thick folder of evidence including Lana's harassing message and documentation of her continued social media posts, despite warnings. The judge reviewed everything carefully before issuing his final order. He maintained the reduced support structure at 20% of my income, with the same clause about possible modification if criminal charges ever got filed. He also made the supervised visitation rights permanent, but emphasized these were rights I could choose to exercise, not requirements. Quentin explained after the hearing that this was actually a significant victory for our side. We'd established legal precedent that reproductive fraud mattered in determining parental obligations. Other lawyers could now cite this case when arguing similar situations. The judge had acknowledged in his written order that consent in conception was a relevant factor, not just biological paternity. Quentin seemed genuinely proud of what we'd accomplished, even though I still felt conflicted about the whole situation. Walking out of the courthouse that day felt different from all the other times, like maybe this chapter was actually closing. I spent a lot of time thinking about whether to pursue visitation rights now that everything was settled legally. My therapist said there was no right or wrong answer, just what felt authentic to me and my situation. I talked to Paul about it, and he said he'd support whatever I decided. My mom wanted me to at least meet the baby once, but she also understood why I was hesitant. After weeks of consideration, I decided not to pursue visitation for now. I needed to focus on my own healing and building a stable life for myself. The trauma of how this child came to exist made it impossible for me to separate those feelings from any potential relationship. Quentin assured me I could revisit the decision in the future if my feelings changed. He said there was no legal or moral requirement to have a relationship with a child created through violation of my consent. That validation from my lawyer helped me feel less guilty about my choice. I would fulfill my financial obligations because the law required it, but I didn't have to force an emotional connection that didn't exist. 2 weeks after the final hearing, a letter arrived at my apartment from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal written apology from Lana's parents. They acknowledged they had acted on false information and expressed regret for the assault and harassment. The letter said they'd learned more about what actually happened at that party and realized their daughter hadn't been honest with them. They apologized for the spitting and the death stares and for enabling Paul to punch me. The apology felt genuine in a way that surprised me, like they'd actually done some reflection about their actions. I sat with the letter for a few days, trying to decide how to respond. Eventually, I wrote back through their lawyer accepting the apology, but explaining I wasn't ready to have direct contact. I asked Quentin to maintain the restraining order even with the apology. Just because they felt bad now didn't erase what they'd done or make me feel safe around them. People who were that quick to violence based on one person's story weren't people I wanted in my life. The restraining order would stay in place, and they would stay away from me and my workplace. That boundary felt necessary for my continued healing and safety. 3 weeks after the final court order, Eddie pulled me aside during my shift and told me I was promoted to shift supervisor with a $2 raise. He said he was impressed by how I handled everything with dignity when most people would have fallen apart completely. The promotion meant more responsibility, but also more money and better hours, which helped me feel like my life was actually moving forward instead of staying stuck. The regular customers who'd witnessed the harassment started treating me differently too. Mrs. Smith, who came in every morning for her black coffee, started bringing me homemade dumplings twice a week. The college students who studied at the corner table always made sure to ask how I was doing, and one of them even offered to help if I ever needed anything. It felt strange having this unexpected support network at work, but also comforting to know people had my back after everything that happened. My mom used what was left from the lawyer fund to book us a cabin in the mountains for a long weekend. We drove up on a Friday after my shift and spent 3 days hiking trails and cooking meals together. On the second day, we climbed to a lookout point and sat on the rocks talking about my plans for the future. She asked if I was thinking about going back to the school or maybe finding a career path beyond the cafe. I told her honestly that for the first time in months, I was actually excited about my life again, instead of just trying to survive each day. The legal battle was over, and I could finally think about what I wanted instead of constantly defending myself. We talked about maybe taking some business classes at the community college so I could work toward managing my own cafe someday. 6 months after the mountain trip, I started dating again, but I was extremely careful about it. On first dates, I was upfront about my situation and why clear consent and communication mattered so much to me in all aspects of relationships. Some women got uncomfortable and never called back, which was fine because I needed people who understood boundaries. Others listened and asked thoughtful questions and seemed to respect what I'd been through. It was scary being vulnerable about what happened, but my therapist said the right people would understand and the wrong ones would filter themselves out. I went on dates with 4 different women over those months, and while none of them turned into serious relationships, I learned I could trust my judgment again. A year after that horrible day in the hospital, I was genuinely doing well. I had my supervisor position at the cafe and was enrolled in 2 business classes at the community college. My apartment felt like home again instead of a place I was hiding. I still saw my therapist monthly, but the panic attacks had mostly stopped. I'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened or forgiving Lana for violating my consent. It was about reclaiming my autonomy and refusing to let someone else's actions define my worth or control my future. The baby existed somewhere in the world as a biological fact, but I'd made peace with my decision to maintain boundaries while fulfilling my legal obligations. My life belonged to me again, and that was what mattered most.